At Allbirds, we kicked off with a couple of great innovations, and I think we did a really nice job of amplifying a brand and personality that resonated with the consumer we were targeting. Novelty and innovation is something consumers never get tired of. We came out of the gates with no advertising and sold $1 million worth of shoes in the first month. And March 13th was the date of 2020. Apple shut down their stores, Tom Hanks had COVID, and the US was thrown into significant disarray in terms of the way that people were living. And the way that people are living makes a pretty big impact on what shoes they buy.
Welcome to the New Build podcast presented by Bubble, where every other week we explore how the playbook for entrepreneurship is changing thanks to evolutions in AI, software, and culture. My name's Abhinav Narayan. I'm a video producer at Bubble, and on today's episode, Bubble co-founder and co-host of this show, Emmanuel Strashnov, is speaking to Joey Zwillinger, an entrepreneur and renewables expert who is probably most well known as the co-founder and former CEO of the sustainable footwear company, Allbirds. During his time as CEO, Joey saw Allbirds rise into a $4 billion publicly traded company, and then subsequently lose nearly all of its value through an incredibly volatile customer market shaken by the pandemic. Joey stepped down as CEO of Allbirds in March of 2024 and is really candid about the whole experience. Emmanuel spoke to him about his perspective and takeaways from it all, as well as how that's helped shape his approach to his next venture, Biologica, a women's health startup helmed by him and his wife Liz, that launched with a $7 million seed round at the end of 2025. Now, regular listeners of our show might notice that this episode is coming out significantly earlier than it should, given our typical bi-weekly schedule. That is in part because many of you may have seen Allbirds has been back in the headlines a few times. On March 30th, the company announced that they had sold off their old IP and assets, and 2 weeks later, just this week, on Wednesday, April 15th, Allbirds announced that it would be foregoing selling footwear entirely and pivoting its business to AI infrastructure. According to the announcement, this pivot is based on a long-term vision to become a fully integrated GPU as a service and AI native cloud solutions provider, and will see the company renamed as Newbird AI. Obviously, some pretty massive news. While we spoke with Joey before some of these announcements, he had some really interesting insights on the company's trajectory in general over the last few years. So we thought you might find it interesting given all the recent developments, hence our earlier release. Stick around after for some Bubble announcements at the end of the episode, but for now, let's go ahead and dive into Emmanuel's chat with Joey.
Hi, Joey. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Phenomenal to be here. I love that you guys have content and love your company. Thrilled to be a part of this.
Thank you. I mean, the first time we met was back in 2019. And so a lot has happened since then. And I think you've been through some experiences that would be very insightful for our people listening here when it comes to company building, early stages, later stages, like a lot of things. So
I'm laughing at the most giant understatement of the century when you talk about 2019 to 2026. We've had a global pandemic that changed consumer behavior and how people work, and then the introduction of AI. So,
Indeed. Yeah. Time is definitely accelerating these days. Yeah. The world was very different back then. I guess maybe to kick us off quickly, you've had a pretty non-traditional journey, right? In the sense that you started more in the science side of things and went to business school, and eventually became like a consumer brand entrepreneur. Can you just share a little bit your journey and how you find some kind of a continuation in your career and like life trajectory?
Yeah, sure. Like weave a thread how I went from being in biotech to a cobbler to making vitamins for women's. Yeah, it's a little bit odd, but yeah,
and shoes on the way. So
that's my cobbler part. That's the cobbler chapter. Yeah, so I guess I'll say I'm an engineer by background, by education. Never a practicing engineer other than the fact that it taught me how to think and wired my brain to be very analytical. And I say that not to suggest that I'm a quant, but that analytical structure guides a lot of how I think about big decisions in particular, and also how it guides me to think about creativity and how we want to constrain creativity to get the best out of what we do for whatever endeavor I'm in. So that way of thinking, I think, led me to the intersection of science, medicine, and technology and consumer. Like those three things, where that intersects the innovation side, where it intersects one of those like more deeper tech orientation or biological functions mixed with consumer, is where I find the most joy and so much interest, because there's such opportunity. Consumers never tire of innovation. If you are able to artfully bring something highly technical, but edit it down and curate the message around that to a consumer in a meaningful way that matches something that they are struggling with, there's unbelievably untapped opportunities everywhere you look. But it takes a high amount of deliberateness to get there. For me, first, when I was in my 20s, I got this itch that climate change was the existential problem for our species in the next 50, 100 years. Other than nuclear threats, I think that's still true. And I thought that there was two ways to go about that. There was two ways to tackle that and contribute to society based on my professional side of my life. One was public policy, which frankly was too boring of an infrastructure for me to tap into. And the second was entrepreneurship. And I thought those two were incredibly pivotal role players in the fight against climate change. So I joined this biotech company. It was called Solazyme at the time, rebranded later to TerraVia, where we engineered microalgae, and we would program it using standard molecular biology tools to metabolize low cost, low carbon emission sources of food. In our case, we use carbon sources like sugarcane or sugarcane waste. And whatever we programmed that organism to do, it would eat the sugar and spit out a designer molecule. And that designer molecule, we engineered it such that it could replace some kind of petroleum derivative. So because we were using microalgae, it was an oil-based product that was the end output. So we had fuels, we had foods, because there's lots of vegetable oil-like foods. And then I ran the chemicals division. And the chemicals division was this super interesting intersection where there was lots of different opportunities. And I was going out to lots of multinational, both B2B players, but also beloved consumer brands that we know, talking about these like wonderful high performance ingredients that they could use, components into their products to offer their customers, their consumer, a no compromise offering that was higher performance and had zero carbon impact on the planet, like literally zero, or maybe even sometimes like negative carbon impact, because it was taking materials that like intakes that sucked carbon out of the atmosphere. Lo and behold, everyone was excited. That sounds cool. And then we got down to the third conversation and it was like, can you just do plastic cheaper? Because that would expand our margins, and that's actually what we kind of need to do. And so that led me to get pretty excited when my wife introduced me to my future co-founder, Tim Brown. She was best friends with his wife, and he had an idea for a shoe. I connected that with a whole systematized platform of materials that we could bring as innovations into the footwear market that could do exactly what I was pitching for those customers who unfortunately fell on deaf ears, and really do something special in terms of sustainable design and sustainable innovation. And I thought there was a dearth of leadership in that space for footwear. So we took that opportunity and we did exactly that. I think regardless of the financial outcome of Allbirds, the impact that we've had on the industry is extremely significant and will forever make its indelible mark on that industry, which I'm quite proud of. And I hope we also do great financially. So did that. And then after 10 years of running that business, I thought it was better to hand it over to somebody who could, for the stage of business that we were in, which was unfortunately a turnaround situation. I felt like there was a better person. I'd hired him a couple years before. We made a very thoughtful transition. I moved to the board and got to chill for a little bit, which was nice. And at that moment, I then got to spend a little time with my wife, with some of the investors that I work with most closely and really respected the most from my journey at Allbirds, and think about what could be an exciting journey next. And I have a pretty low ego and a very high fear of failure, but which motivates me, but also not such a fear of failure that I don't take that next leap. And so was excited by the opportunity to start with two people again. And we thought after a good amount of time, 6 to 12 months of research, consumer insights work, and some technical development on the product side, that we had something pretty special. And so we ended up, Liz and I started Biologica together, and we just launched the business about 18 months after we started really working hard on it back in December of 2025. We're 3 months in as of 2 days ago. And and we're off to the races. And it's very exciting what we're seeing from consumers.
Let's maybe start with Allbirds a little bit. As you said, you didn't see it as a shoe company, but more as a material innovation company. How did that in practice shape some of the decisions you've made in the early years when it comes to hiring, investment, research?
Yeah, I mean, hiring, and I know there's a lot of entrepreneurs that listen to your show. I think it's good to frame up how I was thinking about resources and allocating capital and hiring and things like that. I think what's most important in starting a business is understanding what is the eventual competitive moat that you're creating in the long run. And do you really believe that's a sustainable advantage that has some network effects to it or scaling effects, in the sense that as you put wins on the board, you actually get more of a competitive advantage that's harder for competitors, new entrants or incumbents to dislocate for you. In our case, we had this real foundational belief that if we focused our innovation muscle on sustainable materials, that we could make a product that was differentiated and better for the consumer based on that. Full stop. We also thought we could find ways to make it even cheaper in some cases and things like that. But really what we wanted to do was innovate on quality. So that was either comfort, aesthetics, performance, things like that. And we had a list of 25 at the beginning of innovations that we thought we could explore to tap into to make that happen. And so, what do we do for that? Like I have a background in that, but we needed a proper executive to bring in and cement that leadership and help us put wins on the board quickly. And when you're making physical products, it's not like shipping code where you can do it overnight. It takes a couple years in some cases, and from concept to shelf in the shoe industry, typically 18 months. If you add a material innovation on top of that, it can extend out to 36 months, or even longer sometimes, depending on the kind of innovation. So we had to hire for that really upfront. I had no background in brand marketing, neither did my co-founder Tim. So we also had to hire that because brand and the core innovation muscle, those are the two things that were most important. So I used to refer to this as like the slope of ignorance. Things that are most important to your business in terms of creating a competitive moat, which in Allbirds' case was innovation on sustainable materials and brand, we got to hire brilliant executives up front to help us manage that, and they will do a better job than we can ever do with that. So let's get those on board. And then as you become less ignorant and things become less important, as you go down the list of things that you might want to tackle, that's where you delay spending money on proper executives that can help you do a better job than you can. Because frankly, it just doesn't matter as much to the core competitive advantage that you're creating as a business. So that was generally how I approached it. At Allbirds, we kicked off with a couple of great innovations, and I think we did a really nice job of amplifying a brand and personality that resonated with the consumer we were targeting. And fortunately, because as I said, novelty and innovation is something consumers never get tired of, we came out of the gates with no advertising and sold $1 million worth of shoes in the first month. Our first full calendar year, I think we did something like $60 million, maybe something like that. Super difficult with shoes when you're chasing, you have to make inventory to actually even sell the product. So anyway, I think we got that right there. And I'm very glad that looking back that we hired the expertise that we did and we focused our resources on the things that mattered. And we really tried to not put as much focus on things that were more trivial to the competitive advantage of the business.
Still on Allbirds. So you went from a $4 billion valuation, I think, at IPO, like a fantastic start. And then things after that got much more challenging in the stock market. And I've noticed you've been quite candid, probably more so than most founders here, about what you think went wrong. So can you walk us through your diagnostic? Maybe tell us a story a little bit of how things unfolded after IPO. And what's your diagnostic? What actually broke there?
Sure. So I think in entrepreneurship, you make some very important decisions, and those have to be right. And when you make those important decisions, it's always in an environment with highly ambiguous data. And there's internal data that you're looking at, and there's external factors that you're looking at. And when we started Allbirds, and we started in 2015, but we launched to consumers in 2016, we made some very smart decisions. We also got very lucky. And we had ways, I think we did a good job of capitalizing on our luck at that time. We had some interesting opportunities to reach consumers really effectively. We put a very concise, clear message that worked for the way that we could speak to consumers, and it resonated. And good decisions on top of good luck and good timing was great. Fast forward 4 years, we're a 4-year-old company, over $200 million in revenue, with like nascently maturing capabilities for things that are pretty important for a footwear company that's a very difficult industry to operate in. And March 13th was the date of 2020. Apple shut down their stores. Tom Hanks had COVID, and the U.S. was thrown into significant disarray in terms of the way that people were living. And the way that people are living makes a pretty big impact on what shoes they buy. We put out our first like light performance shoe in April of 2020. We'd been developing it for 18 months, and we did $50 million in sales on that one single shoe over the next 12 months. And I mean, for a company that's $200 million in revenue, that's an absolute banger. And we read very positive signals from our consumers suggesting that, hey, keep pushing here. Like, we tried to innovate slowly in the way we ask consumers to come along with the brand. We would like to say 1 degree of weird was like a good way to push the boundaries of your innovation, but 2 degrees of weird was too weird. And so we went 1 degree of weird. We got a really positive signal. And at the same time, we were also trying to match our success on the product side with our distribution so that we could reach more consumers. So we built some stores. We started working in some international regions. And initially, these were all like pretty successful endeavors. These stores that we were making were the best retail numbers I had ever seen from a retail, not just in our industry, but like in most other industries aside from maybe hardware, electronic hardware. So anyway, we did those things. And unfortunately, I think back to the decisions you make and the luck that you have in 2020, the signals we were getting sometimes were false positives and sometimes they were false negatives. So we thought that the stores, the retail traffic completely evaporating from stores was going to come back. Like, why wouldn't it come back to normal after COVID was over in a year or whatever it was going to be? Turned out it was like 3 years and it changed significantly. So we misread that signal. Secondly, we because we were so new, we misread the signal that consumers wanted us to move and edge into performance more formidably. And as a result of that, despite the fact that, and that's why I say false positive, $50 million was objectively an incredible outcome. But frankly, I think what was happening in hindsight is that people who hadn't run in 15 years were buying whatever running shoe from the brand that they happen to like the most right then. And then they stopped doing that, by the way. They don't run anymore. So it was this really volatile consumer environment. So I think the bad luck in terms of what happened to consumers for us was exacerbated by some decisions that in hindsight, I don't think there's any way you could have faulted some of the decision making that we made at the time, other than perhaps taking more prudence and conservatism with some of the fixed cost investments. And as COVID continued to go, it was very difficult to see these. And as I say, it's an 18-month cycle for product development and footwear. Fast forward 18 months from there, we were in a situation where we were a public company, go public with about a $2 billion valuation. And we were sitting on a mountain of inventory that was not selling through. And we, frankly, really couldn't have foreseen it. In fact, our wholesale partners at the time, we just started to get into wholesale, which was something we always wanted to do after, call it like 3-4 years of working directly with our consumers. Our retail partners backed up the truck. They're like, these new products are incredible, bring it in. And lo and behold, when those products finally got to market, call it like late 22, early 23, they didn't sell through on our website. They didn't sell through on our retailers' websites. They didn't sell through in our retailer stores because we had frankly misread the signal and exacerbated a very difficult piece of bad timing and luck for where the business was as a young company. And it's in this industry, there's so many fixed costs, huge inventory dollars. We had store footprint. We had a lot of fixed costs that were associated with that. So we realized it in 2022, and I decided to initiate a very large turnaround program. It was designed to be a 2-year program, and we needed that time to get through the inventory, match the innovation cycle that we had on our products to something that would resonate very strongly back to kind of the core of what made us successful in the beginning. and also rip out a ton of operational costs and fixed costs that we made investments in. So that 2-year turnaround is probably now in the end of year 3, which is unfortunate. And these things are taking a lot of time. It's very difficult. But if I look back, those are the things and lots of lessons learned there that I'm taking forward into everything I do next, and every piece of counsel I give to people listening on the show and anyone who I spend time with.
What kind of specific pressure did you have to deal with by being a public company? I assume many people, when they start companies, are thinking, great, I want to be ringing the bell and be a public company. What do you say to them?
I mean, when things are going great as a public company, it's fine. It's not that difficult to manage. It's when things are going bad and you're too small. That's the part that really started to weigh on us at Allbirds. I mean, we went public. It's less about the pressure, for me at least. It's more about the fact that as you're going through a turnaround as a subscale company, like we were $300 million in sales as a public company. In consumer, it's just too small. And in footwear, it's really hard before you're 500 million. Now, we thought we were going to get to 500 million quite quickly once we went public in late 21, early 22. So we didn't think that was going to be an issue. Lo and behold, all those things that I just described in terms of the journey there. What happens is every quarter that you give results, the press loves to absolutely shit on you. No journalist at this moment in time is writing about positive things that are happening, because frankly, it doesn't get clicks, and their industry is largely dying. So they're just looking for clicks to get paid on stuff. The unfortunate reality is that the quarterly reporting cadence ends up creating negative externalities that actually impact the true operations of your business. So partners are less likely to partner with you, and employees get squirrely, and vendors get a little squirrely. So those things weighed on me as a public company CEO more than anything, frankly. Those are the challenges that came through. The actual mechanics of being a public company are annoying, and they're very costly. At peak, we were probably spending $10 to $12 million a year on just public company costs, which I call it 10 to 12% EBITDA margins, $100 million of revenue that you have to cover just to be a public company. So it gives you that kind of quantifiable way to think about what scale needs to look like in a consumer business. That part is annoying. It's less now. Insurance is a large part of that in the early days of being a public company, but it's less of the impact on the company vis-a-vis what happens when things get negatively perceived in the media and you can't control the narrative as much. And these kind of quasi-journalists are starting to actually dictate some of the feelings that people that are important to your company are, which is difficult.
And so why did you get public in the first place? What was the pros in your mind before you got to market?
The pace of growth that we were going was quite substantial. I mean, up until the day we went public, I can't remember exactly what the numbers were, but maybe somewhere between 40 to 60% annual growth. And we had expected to be growing in the 30s for a number of years beyond that. So with that kind of growth, like, it is the best way to get the best value for your company, being a public company, if you can deliver that. That's one aspect. We also wanted money to continue to make these investments, and not just at that point the core of what the company was. We wanted to continue to accelerate, but that was self-funding at that point. It was really about the distribution to get out and continue to reach more consumers out there. So we did need capital to make those continued investments. And we took a deal with people who gave us money in the first place that they had to get it back somehow. So we had two options. We had to sell the business, or we took it public and allowed them to sell their shares that way. And we felt like being an independent company was the best way to fulfill the promise of the brand at the time. And so the logical outcome of that was to be an independent company and to be an independent public company. Now, that said, had somebody come along and created something for us where we could have sold the business and would have had more ability to further cement the leadership we created from those competitive moats, I had no dogmatic view, neither did Tim, that we shouldn't do that. Just difficult in this industry to find somebody like that.
And going back to the pressure of being public and the fact that the external world is shaping a narrative for your employees, what have you learned about how to give your team confidence in the future when something like that is happening? Do you have some tips here of what has worked when it's about talking to the team in a difficult world?
I mean, my general approach has always been to build an incredibly transparent company. And I'll define what that means for how I think about it. Everyone hopefully here knows that if you don't have good people in your company has no chance of being successful unless
Right.
you have some like crazy cool IP that you get to sit on.
Milk. Right.
And even then, if you don't have amazing people, your company's going to suck. So how do you get the full potential out of amazing people if they don't have the context that they need to make the micro decisions every single day in the way that you hope they are? Because you're not sitting there over their shoulder telling them, oh, don't do that. Like, oh, that was a bad call. You have to give them all the context that they need to understand in order to make those micro decisions in an extraordinarily effective way. And so I think in good times and in bad times, it's incredibly important to frame that. Now, you need to make a very smart judgment as a leader in terms of what is the kind of transparency that is most effective to make people do the best at their jobs. And that's how I tried to outline it. So when it comes to the good times, it's being circumspect on things that look too good to be true. It's also about celebrating the things that are working, because both of those things need to be addressed. You always need to accentuate the good and try to stop doing the bad. In times of bad times, I think it's the one nuance to it is that I believe that putting a framework around what is going to happen is very important. Most people, vast majority of people, do not like ambiguity and don't operate well in an environment of uncertainty. The vast majority of people, very sophisticated, great executives, that is just a challenging mode for them to be operating in. And so I think in times of uncertainty and unease, it's more incumbent on the leader to put a framework together that outlines what they should expect over the coming period of time, and preferably a fairly long period of time. So when we did the turnaround, as an example, at Allbirds, it was really important for me that we had the full 2 years mapped out. This is what you need to expect, and these are the milestones that we should be trying to achieve as we go through this. Here are the big initiatives. Here's how we're going to resource it. Come together if you want to be a part of it. Let's do this. And, that it's fine if you don't keep everyone. In fact, when things go bad, that's when you kind of find who the people are that haven't just been motivated by momentum and success and money. That's where the true soldiers show their cards. So anyway, I'd say that's the one nuance to it. And that's the way I've approached it. And I find it to be quite successful.
And so you stepped down in March 24, right? And after that, so how long did you take off? This is more of a question around personal management as you go through such a journey. And I'm sure some people listening have been going through some things like that in their entrepreneurial careers.
Yeah. So first, maybe before I answer your direct question, I'll say that the transition of something like that's really important. So Joe's the new CEO, had been talking about it for almost a year. I seeded the idea. He was interested. 6 months before we made the transition, we started to get extremely concrete about it, and we got to make plans together. So I could do the dirty work on letting go some people that we needed to let go for the new chapter. He could be in concert with me on hiring the new key team members that we needed to be successful in the future chapter. So we did that together, laid out the strategy, spent every day as partners until the day that I announced to the public markets that I was leaving. That was the same day I announced it to employees. And then the next day I went down to 0 day-to-day work at Allbirds the next day. And that was good for him, for Joe. It was good for the company because I didn't want people nipping around being like, oh, Joe's doing this thing. You would have done it differently. I like you. Why didn't you come? Blah, blah, blah. All that bullshit. That didn't happen. And it was great for me because I got to go to 0% day-to-day work and just do board responsibilities. And I took my time and gave Joe a lot of space as a board member, holding my tongue at certain things that he was making calls on that we hadn't discussed, things like that. Anyways, that was really important. That gave me time to not just, I'd already emotionally gone through it before the transition actually happened. I sat there and had a wonderfully relaxing time for 3 months. And then I started getting to work because I got excited about Biologica. So that's different for different people. I'm not going to suggest that's the formula. I love building things. We have a setup where my wife and I are equally eager and excited by the journey on that. And And so it was natural for us to take that next step, albeit we knew now how hard it is to build a business. And so I think we were a little more eyes wide open in terms of what we were taking on when we did that, particularly when you take money and did that. So the process that we went through to make that decision to start Biologica was much lengthier and more deliberate and more thoughtful, because I think we knew all the ugly side of being an entrepreneur and just the daily grind and eating glass and having people say things to you that are annoying and a hindrance to what you're trying to do.
So what are you doing differently now at Biologica compared to Allbirds?
So I guess maybe a few things just to reflect on in terms of the new world. I sometimes empathize with large companies, and if I look back at the shoe industry, Nike wanted to be a really sustainable company, but man, it's hard to change consumers' perception of what a brand is. They're in peak athletic performance aspirational brand. That's what they are. And they translated that into a great fashion business. They are not going to be the sustainable innovator. So even though they wanted to, I could see how hard it was for them to change that. And that, in my eye, gave an opportunity for an entrepreneur to come in and do it right. So I think reflecting on that, if you're starting a business today, being an AI native thinker and understanding that the pace of change is so high and that you need to develop a company with a DNA inside that company culture that is incredibly dynamic and agile. If you don't do that, you don't actually have the advantage over the incumbents that are going to have a really hard time doing that. I look at your company, Bubble, and you have your classic innovator's dilemma right now, where you've done something incredible and there's this huge external shock, like Andy Grove would have said in Only the Paranoid Survive. And what do you do with that? And I think you guys are doing a phenomenal job of adapting to it and accentuating the best things about your business that was in the pre-AI era with that. But I think if you don't do that from the start, you're in trouble, or at least you have something very significant to deal with. And it's a very difficult transformation. So I'd say that's one aspect. I think that's pretty obvious to most people starting businesses today. The other thing I would say is back to my recommendation on hiring. When you identify what the competitive moat is that's going to have your scaling impact, your network effects, it's still even more important today to hire those people with the depth of world-class expertise earlier than what it was previously. And I say that because a lot of the work that was a little bit more of the tedious stuff is actually coming easier now, but you need senior expertise to guide the strategic approach more importantly than ever today. So similarly, what I did at Allbirds, I did it even earlier at Biologica. We hired a doctor on staff from day one almost that did huge amounts of clinical research and then would synthesize that in a way that I could then digest it and match it to what Liz and I are hearing on the consumer side of what consumers need to benefit their health, and translate that into a really deliberate and thoughtful product process. So I'd say that's kind of like, AI native, hiring the best and the brightest in the areas that develop your competitive moat even earlier and with more focus is important. And the last thing I would say is a little more nuanced to just me. I at Allbirds, there was a lot of subjectivity. It is at the end of the day a fashion business, whether you like it or not, and there's a lot of subjectivity in that. And Tim and I were making products where we were the target consumers, and there was a lot of intuition and subjectivity that we imposed on that product process. Now, making women's health supplements, I don't have a lot of subjective bias in that. And I don't have much intuition, frankly, because I've never had anywhere close to the life experience that our target consumer is going through. And so it forced me to be much more of a curious, driven, and empathetic leader, where I am seeking consumers for the answers, seeking out those answers from consumers. And so there's an incredible amount of deliberate listening that we do as a business to make sure that we are doing things that are going to meet a very large population of people's needs. And we do that as simply as we can. So we learn all of those needs really deeply, and then we run a product development process to make sure we're hitting 90% of women's needs. I'm making those numbers up, but that's the idea, the direction that we're focused on. And how do we do that? With as few SKUs as possible, because I got really tired of hundreds and thousands of SKUs that we had to manage at Allbirds. It's really nice just to have 6 to start here, and we can ride that for quite a while. So anyway, that's a few of the lessons I picked up.
How is it to work with your spouse? I learned in business school when I went to business school a long time ago that I think the closer you are to your co-founder, the lower the chances of success are. That's what I learned back then. And so the spouse is actually the worst person you could be starting a business when you look at the odds.
Yeah,
of
if that's
success.
the rule, if that's the rule,
academics.
that does sound like the worst. I hope you're wrong.
I mean,
Pick that rule up.
it's statistics, right? So you can always prove them wrong. But so how is that how does it work in practice?
I would say, I mean, we do great together. I think one of the things that we picked up on was the most important person for me at Allbirds was Liz. We were like talking strategy, talking personnel every day. And she was my most important strategic advisor. And so I already knew how she thought. She knew what my strengths were and my weaknesses. And I think that gave us like a really strong foundation to think that we could be successful doing it together here. We have a very, very strong relationship. We actually like each other quite a lot. And so that's helpful. And then I would say the thing that we probably missed a little bit is, it's interesting to me. I think it's kind of obvious when I say it, but the work never impacts our relationship. But our relationship outside of work sometimes impacts our relationship at work. I'd say that's probably the pitfall, and like coming in super clear-eyed about that is, I think, helpful. The fact that it caught me by surprise is not going to be a problem, but it's just an interesting observation I've made, is that when I'm being an ass at home and she's annoyed with me for that, that might actually impact our business a little bit, versus what I probably would have thought was the other way around. I'd get annoyed with her doing something at work or vice versa, and that would go into and affect our relationship, so to speak. So anyway, I think it's been great. I think there's some amazing success stories, particularly in CPG, around husband-wife duos, and I'm excited to be part of one of the next ones.
Right. Well, the fact that you've been a second-time founder building something impressive with Allbirds, if you look at the whole trajectory of the company, has that changed how people give you feedback, whether it's advisors, investors?
Definitely. I mean,
so how do you deal with that? Yeah. How do you get feedback from people?
Yeah, it's like a first-time founder. I think, honestly, no matter who you are, if you're a first-time founder, most people just don't give you the benefit of the doubt. And the ones who like really latch onto your vision and they do give you the benefit of the doubt, there's still less credibility that's lent to you in terms of the decisions that you're making. Second time around, I find that people who saw how I worked and believed in the integrity of how I led businesses and the thoughtfulness I delivered at Allbirds, which is, not everybody. I'm sure people thought I did a bad job in some things. But the people who really liked it, they tend to see somebody who has been there a little bit more and has sometimes more experience than what they could ever advise you on. That said, the best investors in the world, like the ones that I'm working with now in particular, they have great pattern recognition over a broad landscape of companies that they can give you things. Hey, here are the benchmarks. This is what typically happens. So let's think about that as context when you're making your decisions. But they give you the benefit of the doubt much more significantly than what they would the first time. People tend to, vendors, celebrities, whoever you need to make your business more successful, tend to pick up the phone because of who you are. And they may not have done that the first time around. They may have needed to see momentum and success. So it's almost a benefit of manifesting your own success, which is fantastic. That said, the feedback, as you mentioned, can sometimes be a little too rosy and they give you too much of the benefit of the doubt. And so it's more difficult to get really tough feedback when you're not finding the 50 no's from investors and they tell you all the reasons why you're being dumb, some of which are pretty smart, and you learn from that. I've had to go out of my way a little bit to find some of that. And in some cases, it includes doing expert calls every week to figure out what you don't know about things and getting real feedback anonymously often so that they don't know who you are, frankly. And a lot more, as I say, on the listening side, like structured market research, structured focus groups, like where I'm not involved in it, I'm observing it after the fact. Those are really important things for me now to continue to get a lot of discipline in, because I'm not always getting quite as much feedback. That said, I've also surrounded myself here with like amazing board members, amazing investors, fantastic world-class advisors that are like not worried about telling me the hard stuff. And I think looking back at Allbirds, I was a little scared to bring in extraordinarily smart industry domain specific advisors really early on because I was not getting as much credibility from the other group of people, and those people's voices become a very strong weight in the room. Now I have equal credibility. The advisors really respect me, but I deeply respect them, and there's no bullshit between us. Like, we can just talk real and get that information, and I can openly share all this stuff in a board meeting, and no one's having these negative assumptions or doubts. It's a really nice situation, but I do think it requires a little bit more maintenance of discipline.
I mean, as we're getting close to wrap up, just want to talk about software a little bit and AI and buying and building. Like, so you started Allbirds on Shopify. I think you've scaled it very far with Shopify. How do you think about this today, given the recent trends in technology, like the fact that now the cost of creating products is getting cheaper and cheaper with AI? And how has that changed for you with Biologica? Are you doing things differently from that point of view?
Not that much, I will say. And I think there's like, in the commerce space, there's been like 1.0 in the late aughts and early 2010s. Then we were kind of 2.0, where we could build on a commerce platform like Shopify. We were really early in terms of enterprise scale for Shopify. And now it's kind of 3.0, where it can be the Shopify plus the ecosystem, but there's also so much incredible software surrounding that is AI enabled or sometimes not. And I've always had the mentality, starting a business in 2015, at least from that point, that unless, as I said, back to the hiring thing we talked about, is my competitive moat going to be technology as a consumer product company? It will not be. We need to be incredibly intelligent around being technology enabled. And so for me, that bias is very strongly to buying rather than building. And so I think right now, I would say the reason I say we're not doing things differently is because we're buying most of the things that we have from a technology perspective. And in buying the best of the modern edge landscape, we are ingesting all of the benefit of AI that those best vendors are using. So that's the approach that we've kind of continued to take here. The tools are wildly different. They're much more efficient. We have to hire many fewer people, and that puts an importance on hiring really top talent. And I think, so yeah, it's like, for me, developing something ourselves without the use of sophisticated tools like Bubble would be a fool's errand. And building things yourself, like hard things, like I'm talking about hard things, like the base level stuff. Unless you're a technology company, I just have no idea why someone would take that approach. And the tools are incredible now.
That's fair. I guess one last question as we wrap this up, and thank you again so much for taking the time to talk to us today. What's something you think most founders are not paying enough attention to right now?
The music's going to stop at some point. One of my investors told me in 2015, when he gave our first check, he said, take this money and spend it like you don't have it. In a R&D centric business like technology, getting money while money is cheap is very important. But I think people are naturally inclined to spend the money like they have to spend the money. And it's really hard not to. But at this moment in time, I would say being extraordinarily prudent and cautious with your investment dollars, capital allocation, is more important than ever, because you can get it cheap, but things can change very quickly and very negatively. And the optimism of an entrepreneur is often outweighs prudence in that case. And I would say that right now is the perfect time to be extraordinarily judicious with your capital allocation. Not saying don't take the money from investors right now, because that's a great time to do it, but be very judicious about how you spend that money, because that is something like the music will stop. Like the momentum game stops. There isn't enough outcomes to support this kind of influx of capital. So the music will stop. So it's really important to position yourself with an absolute war chest and incredibly prudent spending. Again, I think you guys are doing a phenomenal job of that, Emmanuel, and are like a marquee person to be giving advice on this, because I think you've actually absorbed that lesson that my investor told me, and I probably didn't listen to well enough. Certainly listen to it now.
Yeah, that's one thing that I'm proud of about our Bubble journey, is that we've been always very disciplined from a resource allocation point of view, which gives us a lot of options pretty much at any point of time of the company, which is something I'm grateful for. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That was great conversation. I hope everyone listening will enjoy all the learnings here. So
Me too.
thank you again for taking the time, and yeah, see you soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you want to learn more about Allbirds, Joey himself, or the new venture Biologica, helmed by him and his wife Liz, check out the links in our show notes. It's only been a few days since our last episode, but we still have a handful of announcements for you. This team works really fast. Let's take a look. First off, our team integrated Anthropic's new Opus 4.7 into Bubble's AI app generator ahead of their launch just yesterday, April 16th. As before, Bubble worked with Anthropic to test out the new model and provide feedback before release. Second, our full property editor beta rolls out to everyone next week, and it will come with an opt-out toggle. Stay tuned for that. Last, on Monday, April 20th at noon Eastern, on our YouTube channel, there will be a live demo of BuildPrint, the community-built agentic engineering platform made specifically for complex Bubble apps. BuildPrint lets you stay in the flow the way you would with Cursor or Claude Code. It also supports automated no-code testing so you can ship with more confidence and catch issues before your users do. During this live webinar, we'll learn all about it. Check out the link in the description for more details, and be sure to tune in Monday, April 20th at noon Eastern on our YouTube channel. One final note, since this episode was released early, our next episode won't release until later in May. In the meantime, however, you can check out some of our previous episodes if you haven't already. Otherwise, that's it for today's episode. If you're liking the show, please consider leaving us a like and a review. Those really help others to find the show too. Thanks again to Joey for coming on today, and thank you so much for listening. We'll see you in the next one.